The air inside St. Jude's was a musty velvet, thick with the scent of old stone and centuries of candle soot. Ethan wiped a bead of sweat from his temple, the silence in the nave feeling less like peace and more like a heavy blanket. He adjusted his glasses, focusing on the dark alcove across the aisle, avoiding the way Clara was studying the brochure with a focused intensity that was almost aggressive. They were supposed to be having a restorative weekend, a reset, as their therapist had cheerily put it. But here they were, in a remote church in the Mendip Hills, and the forced intimacy was already grating. "I still don't understand why we booked a tour during a planned power outage," Ethan muttered, mostly to fill the oppressive quiet. Clara didn't look up. "It wasn't planned. The warden said a fallen tree on the B road took out a line. Besides, it adds atmosphere, doesn't it? Very authentic." Her voice carried a clipped, professional tone, the same one she used in court before cross-examining a hostile witness. It was a tone Ethan had grown to associate with a deep, personal exhaustion. Authentic to what? The Middle Ages? He sighed, running a hand over the rough texture of a pillar. "It's just making me nervous. I can barely see in here." "Maybe that's the point, Ethan. We're supposed to be seeing past the surface this weekend. Remember? No distractions." She finally met his eyes, and the flicker of something colder than disappointment in her gaze made his stomach clench. It was a look that said, "We are past simple distractions. You are the distraction." They moved to the ancient sacristy, a small, dark room off the altar. The only exit, aside from the way they'd entered, was a massive oak door held shut by a complicated latch and bolted with iron. The wood was so thick it looked like it could stop a tank shell. "The warden said this door leads to a lower crypt," Clara said, pushing her shoulder against it. "He said it hasn't been opened in 70 years. Look at this mechanism." Ethan leaned in, fascinated. It wasn't a hinge or a simple latch, it was a counterbalanced, spring-loaded lock designed to snap shut with incredible force once triggered. "They built this to keep people out, or something in." As Ethan reached for the heavy iron ring, a loud bang echoed from the main part of the church, followed by the sickening sound of crumbling stone. They froze, sharing a look of immediate high-alert panic. Before either could speak, the floor beneath their feet seemed to judder, not violently, but with a deep, subterranean thrum. A large, dust-covered piece of masonry, dislodged from the ceiling above the door frame by the vibration, crashed down. It didn't hit them, but the heavy impact on the stone floor next to the mechanism was enough. The ancient, counterweighted lock sprang instantly to life. With a deafening crack and a grind of rusted iron, the massive oak door slammed inward, closing with the terrible finality of a guillotine. Ethan and Clara didn't have a chance to leap back. They were simply in the way. The lower half of the door instantly wedged itself against their shins and calves. A breath of pure, blinding agony tore from Ethan's lungs. He stumbled, catching himself on the wall, and looked down. The door's edge was pressed so tightly against the thick bone of his lower leg that he couldn't feel his feet. Clara was a silent, white-faced statue next to him, her breathing coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "Oh, God," she whispered, her voice a thin thread. I can't move my legs." "Mine either," Ethan grunted, bracing his hands on the floor to take the pressure off his shins. "It's too heavy. It's the weight of the whole door. We're completely jammed." He pushed his shoulder against the rough wood, an exercise in futility. The door was a wall. As the frantic, adrenaline-fueled shock began to subside, a new sound filtered through the ancient stone, distant and thin. It was a high-pitched, choked shriek, followed by a series of ragged, rhythmic thumps. "It's probably an ambulance, or maybe someone crashed on the B road," Clara said, her voice strained but attempting to be practical. Her training as a litigator was already kicking in, trying to establish a plausible narrative. "We're rural. Bad phone service. We just need to wait for the warden to come back and call the fire department." "That wasn't a siren, Clara." "That sounded like—" Ethan trailed off, unable to form the word terror. He strained his ears, listening past his own throbbing pain. The noises were getting closer, the thumps becoming a disjointed, chaotic chorus of shouts and howls. "It doesn't matter what it was. We need to stay calm and focus on the mechanism," she snapped, her usual impatience resurfacing. "If we panic, we'll make things worse. Is there a latch on this side? We can't just sit here." "There's nothing." It was meant to be sealed from the outside once closed. It's a permanent lock." He looked at his wife, his face pale and suddenly etched with a chilling new reality that had nothing to do with their marriage. "The sounds are too many, Clara. That's not one accident." Suddenly, a sound of crunching gravel, heavy and panicked, drew their eyes to the sacristy's narrow, arched window. A man stumbled past, his clothes shredded, his face a mask of scarlet blood, his eyes wide and vacant. He was running not with terror, but with a blind, stumbling desperation. Before they could fully process the image, the man was replaced by shadows. A group of figures shuffled into view, their movements jerky and unnatural. They didn't run. They moved with a slow, grinding inevitability. A low, guttural, non-human growl emanated from the mob, a sound that bypassed the ear and resonated in the chest. They were tearing at the earth and at each other, their faces contorted into hungry, ruinous masks. Clara inhaled sharply, the practiced calmness finally fracturing, replaced by a pure, animal terror. She looked at the frantic scene outside, then down at the immovable oak crushing her legs, and finally at Ethan, her breathing ragged. "Ethan," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. This isn't an accident. We're stuck." The world had ended, not with a bomb or a flood, but with a sudden, deafening slam of an ancient oak door, trapping them as the horror shuffled past their window. The screams outside were no longer faint. They were the overture to their new reality. The monstrous, dragging sound of the horde faded into the distance, leaving behind an adrenaline-soaked, ringing silence. Ethan and Clara, still locked in the lower frame of the oak door, didn't dare move. The scent of dust and ancient mildew was now overwhelmed by the metallic tang of fear. The moment of shared terror had forced a fragile, primal cooperation, but the reality of their impossible position was already starting to chafe. "My bag!" Clara hissed, her voice a thin, reedy sound of suppressed agony. "It's on the floor, just out of reach. Can you get it with your foot?" Ethan tried to twist his upper body. The heavy oak pressed a searing pain into his shins, a sensation that had settled from a spike of agony into a throbbing, relentless pressure. "I can't. We're too tight. It feels like this door is fused to my bone." He reached into the small pocket of his trousers. His fingers brushed against his car keys and his phone. He pulled the phone out. "Dead," he announced, the single word a crushing weight. "No signal? No power." "I should have charged it in the car." "Of course you should have," Clara retorted, the bitterness immediate and sharp. "You always leave the necessary things until the last minute, don't you? Like repairing the roof, or having that conversation we were supposed to have before this trip." The pain was turning her frustration outward, and Ethan felt the familiar, toxic surge of anger that had defined the past 6 months of their marriage. "This is not the time, Clara," he ground out, pushing back against the door again, hoping sheer will could move the weight of centuries. It didn't budge. "Oh, when is the time, Ethan? When we've bled out? We're stuck between a crypt and the end of the world. And you want to pretend that your inability to be prepared for anything isn't the reason we're in this mess? Hell, why we were in a mess before this." Her eyes, wide and terrified, were fixed on his. She wasn't talking about the phone anymore. Ethan snatched the small, half-full water bottle from the breast pocket of his jacket, twisting off the cap with shaking fingers. "Here. Drink. Stop using this situation to pick a fight." She took a careful, measured sip, her focus shifting. The water seemed to bring a sliver of clarity. "We need a plan, not a squabble." She pointed to the space behind them. "We're not just pinned against the main door. We're in that little shallow recess the warden mentioned, the old priest's niche. Look. They were trapped in a space no deeper than 1.5 feet, wedged right in the doorframe. The only objects they could access were whatever was in their pockets or within their arm's reach against the stone wall. Ethan had a penlight. Clara had a small, blunt nail file. He pushed the penlight's beam along the door's edge. "We need leverage. If we can move this door even an inch, the mechanism might release." He jammed the car key into the tiny gap between the wood and the stone floor, trying to use it as a wedge. The key bent instantly, the metal shrieking in protest. "Useless!" He tossed the mangled key away. Clara took the nail file, her expression one of grim determination. She tried to insert it into the iron latch mechanism, probing the rusted parts. "It's not a lock, Ethan. It's a massive spring and counterweight. Whatever triggered it is internal. We need something with mass, not finesse." Her breathing hitched, the sound startlingly loud in the confined space. "My leg. I think the blood is pooling. It's a deeper pain now." The psychological stress was beginning to manifest as a suffocating closeness. The weight of the door, the stone walls pressing in, the silence waiting outside, it was a vice grip on their sanity. Just as the claustrophobia threatened to bubble over into a scream, a shadow appeared at the sacristy window. It was slow, staggering, and immense. A single shuffler. It paused, head tilted, its ruined face pressed close to the glass, fogging the pain. It had heard something, the scraping of the key, the metallic clang of the nail file, or perhaps just Clara's ragged breath. Its eyes, white, vacant, and ringed with dried black blood, stared directly into the gloom of the sacristy. It raised a ruined hand and brought it down on the glass with a jarring, wet thwack. Ethan's heart seized. He felt Clara's hand immediately find his arm, her grip iron-hard and desperate. The shuffler, sensing movement or warmth, began to bang more insistently, a steady, blunt percussion that seemed to shake the very stone. In that terrifying instant, there was no room for their marital history, their accusations, or their pain. There was only the singular, absolute need to survive. Ethan tightened his grip on her hand, meeting her gaze. Without a word, they synchronized their movements, leaning their heads back against the cold, damp stone, holding their breath, becoming as still and silent as the corpses beneath the floor. The banging continued for an agonizing minute, then stopped. The shadow lingered, its low, hungry growl vibrating through the window pane. Finally, slowly, it scraped its way out of sight. Silence returned. Ethan let out the breath he'd been holding, a shuddering release. "The window," Clara whispered, her voice husky. "It's brittle. We have to secure it. If one gets in, we're finished." Ethan nodded, his mind now coldly focused. "Agreed. We use my jacket, the heavy tweed, to cover the lower half. We need to block the light when the sun comes up. And we ration this." He held up the water bottle. "Small sips, one every hour. We'll have to wait for daylight. Someone might see the broken window, or the warden might return. That's our plan. Secure. Ration. Wait. It was a pathetic, meager plan, but it was their plan. For the first time in a very long time, they were facing the same enemy, shoulder to shoulder, paralyzed, but together. The cold stone pressed against their backs, a silent promise of a long, terrifying night. The tweed jacket, heavy and rough, lay spread over the lower half of the arched window, held in place by two small, flat stones Ethan had managed to scrape loose from the wall with the nail file. The gloom inside the sacristy deepened, but the crucial visual link between the outside world and their terror was severed. "It's not perfect, but it's enough to hide us until the sun rises," Clara whispered, her voice still strained with the effort of control. Her fear had sharpened her focus, turning her from an argumentative wife into a tactical analyst. "Good job, Ethan." The simple compliment felt like a reprieve. "We're making do," he replied, adjusting his glasses. The pain in his legs was a steady, burning fire now, a constant reminder of their paralysis, the immediate threat. Their temporary peace was immediately shattered by the sickening sound of metal crumpling outside. A car, moving too fast and clearly driven by panic, had slammed into the stone wall bordering the churchyard. The ensuing silence was brief, followed by a muffled, hysterical scream, and then the wet, tearing sounds that made Ethan's stomach heave. "They're turning," Clara breathed, her head pressed against the stone wall. "It's that fast." "God, look." Though their view was partially blocked, the shadows cast by the church lights outside, briefly flickering on a backup generator before dying again, danced madly on the wall. The number of figures visible through the upper uncovered pane had doubled, perhaps tripled. The frantic movements of fresh victims had drawn them in. The chorus of low, hungry growls was no longer distant. It was right outside the building. "We are not waiting for daylight. We're waiting for death," Ethan said, the hopelessness a lead weight in his voice. "Stop it." "Self-pity is a luxury we can't afford," Clara snapped back, though her face was pale. "We need what's in the bags. My purse has the small first aid kit. Yours has snacks. Their bags, their only connection to their former lives, lay agonizingly on the dusty floor of the main sacristy just beyond their reach. My coat. I can take it off and try to hook the strap," Ethan said, carefully peeling the heavy tweed from his shoulders, the movement sending spasms of pain down his legs. He used the coat's extended length, twisting and hooking the material with the intensity of a surgeon. The strap of Clara's leather purse snagged. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, he dragged it across the stone floor. When it finally bumped against the door, Clara seized it, her fingers tearing open the zipper. "Aspirin, antiseptic wipes, and some gauze," she inventoried, her voice hushed with reverence. "And my little tube of water-based energy gel." "Snacks?" She nodded, tossing a small bag of stale trail mix and 2 energy bars from her purse. "Now your backpack. It has the rest." It took another 10 minutes of grueling effort, but they managed to drag the second bag to their feet. Inside, they found their 2 dead cell phones, now useless ballast, a heavier flashlight, a small book of historical sketches, and a larger, more comprehensive first aid kit. Clara immediately got to work, her hands steady as she applied antiseptic wipes to the compressed, bruising skin around their shins. The pressure is the biggest risk. It'll cause deep tissue damage. But at least there's no deep laceration yet, she murmured, the lawyer-turned-medic temporarily taking over. The silence between them was not tense, but expensive. Each moment bought with effort, cooperation, and shared necessity. Eavesdropping and the goal. As Clara taped a makeshift compression bandage around Ethan's calf, a new sound cut through the low, pervasive growling. Human voices, panicked and close. "Keep moving! Don't stop for anyone. The checkpoint is near the old quarry, 3 miles north. They said the National Guard is holding it." The shouts were followed by the rapid pounding of feet, a desperate group of survivors running past the church on the main path. The sounds vanished as quickly as they came, leaving behind a profound stillness. Ethan looked at Clara, a frantic, fragile flicker of hope igniting in his eyes. "The quarry. 3 miles. They have a goal. We have a goal." "Yes," she confirmed, her voice now hard with purpose. "A goal we can't possibly reach. But it gives us a direction. We just need to figure out how to get out of this vice." The first use of force. The relative calm shattered completely when a particularly persistent walker, one whose clothes looked like clerical robes, staggered up to the sacristy window. It was larger and more ruined than the first. It spotted the movement, Ethan shifting his weight, through the small, uncovered upper pane. It didn't bang. It began clawing, its rotten fingernails dragging down the glass. Then, with a sudden surge of corrupted strength, it rammed its shoulder into the lower pane, the ancient glass bowing inward. The tweed jacket threatened to slip. "It's coming in!" Ethan shouted. The walker's face was inches from the glass, its teeth grinding on air. Clara's hand scrabbled inside the backpack, finding the small, heavy object they had noticed earlier. A palm-sized miniature marble carving of Saint Jude, bought as a cynical souvenir. "The carving! Hit its hand!" she yelled. The walker smashed its fist against the glass again, and a loud crack echoed through the chamber. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy marble saint, aimed at the ruinous hand pressing against the glass, and with a grunt of pure, desperate adrenaline, slammed the marble down against the back of the walker's wrist. The sound was a sickening, wet crunch of bone and glass. The walker let out a ragged, screeching hiss, not a human scream, but a sound of pure, frustrated hunger. It staggered back, its ruined hand dangling uselessly, and disappeared into the night. Ethan lowered the marble saint, his chest heaving, his arms shaking. The air in the small niche felt suddenly electric, charged with the brutal reality of what he had just done. He looked at the marble saint, the stone cold, now splattered with dark fluid, and then at Clara, who was staring at him with a mixture of terror and fierce respect. "You did it," she breathed. "You fought back." Ethan didn't recognize the cold, decisive man who had just crushed a bone with a religious trinket. The suburban husband was gone, replaced by a survivor. "We need to secure the window properly," he said, his voice flat and steady. "And we need to find something sharper than a nail file." The silence following the sickening crunch of bone and glass was profound. Ethan, still trembling from the adrenaline of his first violent act, secured the window by jamming the heavy marble saint, now their weapon, into the upper corner of the frame. He looked at Clara. Her face was bleached, her brow slick with sweat, but the look in her eyes was one of concentrated, excruciating focus. "The aspirin," she gasped, her voice tight. "Now, Ethan. A crisis of pain. The localized burning pressure had abruptly transformed into an agonizing, generalized throb. It wasn't just the crush. It was a deep, pervasive ache radiating up her thigh, accompanied by a heavy numbness in her foot. "It's not just compression anymore," Clara whispered, her eyes squeezed shut. I think it's a crush injury. Swelling inside. I feel sick." Ethan fumbled for the aspirin in the small first aid kit. His hands, still shaking from the encounter, nearly dropped the tiny bottle. He wrestled 2 pills out and held the water bottle to her lips. She swallowed them with a grimace. Tending to her in the cramped, dark niche was almost impossible. He could only touch her upper calves, but the restricted movement exacerbated the crushing pressure on her lower legs. He carefully adjusted the makeshift gauze bandage he'd applied earlier, trying to elevate her body slightly with his own strength to ease the pressure on her shins. It was a futile gesture, but necessary. "It hurts, Ethan," she said, her voice small and raw, stripped of its legal composure. "It really hurts." Confession. The pain medication was slow to take effect, but the shared vulnerability had begun to erode the mortar of their defenses. The terror and the physical agony had forced a breach. Ethan leaned his head back against the cold stone. "I haven't been able to sleep well in a year, Clara." "I know," she replied, not with accusation, but with a weary resignation. "You're always tossing." "I thought it was the mortgage debt, or work." "No, it was that I couldn't tell you the truth," he admitted, his voice barely a breath above a whisper. He knew this was the moment of no return. "The night before the trip, when I said I was working late on the accounts for the firm, I wasn't. I was meeting with a lawyer." Clara went utterly still. The intense pain seemed to freeze her tears. "A lawyer. About what?" "Divorce," Ethan confessed, the word a poison in his mouth. "I had the papers drawn up. I brought you here to this quiet place, this reset, because I was trying to find the courage to tell you that I didn't think we could fix it, that I had given up." The crushing emotional impact was worse than the weight of the door. Clara stared at him, her eyes glistening with betrayal. "All this time," she whispered, her voice laced with ice. "You let me think we were fighting for this marriage. You agreed to therapy. You were lying to me. You were planning your escape." "I was lost," he countered, the words tumbling out. "And you were so focused on your career, on the next brief, the next promotion, that I felt like a piece of furniture you occasionally dusted. I just wanted someone to see me." "And you think tearing our lives apart wouldn't destroy me?" she challenged, her voice rising with furious despair. "I built my career so we could have the life we planned." "The life you kept pushing for, and you accuse me of not seeing you? You didn't see me either, Ethan. I was drowning under the pressure, and you were too busy writing me off to even ask if I was okay." They had reached the bedrock of their resentment, the very reason they were crumbling before the world crumbled. Yet, the confession was not a fracture. It was a brutal, necessary excavation. Their eyes locked, no longer husband and wife, but 2 desperate, broken people sharing a grave. The noise trap and the distant hope. Their raised voices had a consequence. A few low, guttural sounds immediately answered them from outside. "Stop," Ethan mouthed, urgently placing a finger to his lips. He squeezed her hand once. Clara nodded, returning a 2-squeeze reply. "I understand." They had established their silent code. 1 squeeze for silence, danger, 2 for acknowledged, 3 for immediate help. Using the faint penlight, Ethan carefully retrieved his dead phone from the backpack and managed to briefly switch on the screen. The battery icon flashed red, but the map application, downloaded for their historical tour, flickered into view. "The quarry," he whispered, his mouth close to her ear. "It's 7 roads north of here. We'd have to cut through that forest. But it's real, Clara. A real checkpoint." The phone died as he spoke, leaving the image of the route. A faint, hopeful line through a dark, uncertain wilderness burned into his mind. The map, however, had solidified their will. They had a destination. The decision. The aspirin had taken the edge off Clara's agony, but the pressure injury remained a serious, life-threatening crisis. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice steady now, the momentary rage replaced by cold logic. "If that swelling continues, I lose the leg. Or worse. The door won't budge. It's the door, not the lock. We need to cut the wood, or something else." Clara took a slow, deliberate breath. "Or we cut the bone, Ethan. We both know it." The unthinkable hung between them. To try and break their own legs, to smash the bones until they were flexible enough to pull out from the crushing grip of the oak. It was a self-mutilation so horrific it defied sanity. "No," Ethan choked out. "Not yet." "We wait for daylight. We wait for the warden. If we can't move in 6 hours, then we talk about radical measures. But we do not give up on rescue. Not while we have a chance." Clara squeezed his hand 3 times. Immediate help. The silent plea was for survival, for hope, and for him to continue being the strong one. She lay her head against his shoulder, 2 wounded souls pressed together in the small, damp niche, facing a terrible dawn. This is an incredible, intense, and detailed roadmap. The tension and stakes escalate perfectly across these final 6 chapters, leading to a massive climax and a poignant resolution. Here are the chapters, flowing seamlessly and maintaining the character development and high-stakes dialogue. The terror of the first night had solidified into a grinding, miserable routine. 3 days had crawled by since the door had snapped shut. Time inside the sacristy was measured only by the rhythmic throbbing in their lower legs and the dwindling contents of the water bottle. The air, once merely musty, now carried a constant, sickening stench, the pervasive, sweet-sour scent of decay from the outside world. "Ethan, my hands are filthy," Clara whispered, scrubbing her palms uselessly on the damp tweed of his coat. Her voice was raspy from dehydration and lack of use. "I can feel the grime under my nails. It's the worst part." Ethan, whose glasses now sat perpetually askew, was meticulously tearing slivers from a piece of his energy bar, the remnants of their first meal in 36 hours. "Cleanliness is a luxury, Clara. Survival is a necessity. Don't waste energy on what we can't fix." The small niche had been searched a dozen times, but desperation demanded another inspection. Ethan used his penlight to trace every crack and seam. The resource scramble. "Look," he whispered, his finger pointing at a tiny crevice near the floor. He managed to dislodge a forgotten, dusty hymnal, its pages water-damaged and curled. It was utterly useless for fuel or food, but the sight of its text felt like a link to a sane world. Clara smiled faintly, a ghost of the sharp, beautiful smile he hadn't seen in years. "All things bright and beautiful," she murmured, reading the cover. "A little out of place, wouldn't you say?" She found a small, tarnished silver crucifix tucked into a crack behind her head, probably left by the previous priest. It offered no practical help, but the act of discovery was a distraction. It was a scavenger hunt for nothing, yet it staved off the abyss, the unwelcome guest. Their miserable quiet was violently interrupted. A sound of skittering claws and desperate sniffing came from the main floor of the sacristy, just beyond the door's edge. A creature emerged, thin and enormous. A rat, emboldened by the scent of the nearby trail mix. It darted across the floor, its eyes glittering in the gloom, clearly searching for the source of their limited supplies. "Get it away!" Clara hissed, her body tensing, the thought of infestation and disease immediate. Ethan grabbed the only non-sanitary object he had, his mangled car key, and tossed it with a clatter. The rat squeaked and vanished into the shadows, but the intrusion had rattled them. The walls of their prison suddenly felt smaller, dirtier, and more hostile. The long view. The rat's appearance had brought their tension to a peak, and to calm themselves, they retreated to memory, the one resource the world couldn't take. "Do you remember that place in Cinque Terre?" Ethan asked, his voice softer, lost in the past. "The little balcony. We ate those fresh figs." Clara closed her eyes, letting the memory override the stench of decay. "You got so seasick on the ferry. You insisted we walk the remaining 6 miles, and then complained the whole way that your knees were going to give out." A low, genuine laugh escaped her lips. "My knees were fine," he defended weakly, smiling. "It was the forced intimacy of the walking that was the problem. You kept trying to hold my hand, and I had sunscreen on." The triviality of the old argument was comforting. It led to the deeper, more important memory. "I was so scared on our wedding day," Clara confessed, her gaze settling on the useless silver crucifix in her hand. "Not of you, but of failing, of not being enough, of losing myself to the partnership. I let my work become my wall because I didn't know how else to feel safe." Ethan reached for her hand, squeezing it. "I used the lie of the divorce papers as a shield. If I planned to leave, I never had to deal with the fear of you leaving me first. It's pathetic." This was their pivot point. They had confessed the worst sins of their separation. Now they were sharing the best memories of their union, refueling the why of their survival. The vultures. Their quiet introspection was violently shattered by the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood from the town below. Through the small, uncovered window pane, they watched a terrifying spectacle. A small group of uninfected scavengers, 4 men with rough clothes and crude weapons, kicking down the door of a cottage. They weren't fighting the walkers. They were fighting each other for goods. One man was tackled for a box of canned food, his scream cut short not by a bite, but by a brutal, sickening blow to the head with a heavy wrench. The remaining 3 quickly gathered what they wanted, ignoring the fresh body and the shuffling walkers that soon converged on it. Clara recoiled, pulling her head down below the window frame. "It's worse than them," she breathed, gesturing toward the walkers. "The humans. They're cold. They're efficient." Ethan knew she was right. They weren't trapped between an infectious death and freedom. They were trapped between 2 different kinds of monsters. Their resolve hardened. If they got out, they couldn't trust anyone. They had only each other. The pain in Clara's leg was now a permanent resident. The aspirin helped blur the edges, but the underlying severity of the crush injury was undeniable. The relentless pressure was threatening permanent damage. "We need to stop talking about rescue, Ethan," she said, her voice thin but controlled. "We need to talk about getting this door to move." A broken friend. A shadow fell across the tweed-covered window. Unlike the stumbling masses, this figure stopped directly at the sacristy door, its movements strangely hesitant. It wasn't scratching or biting. It was simply standing there, its ruined face pressed against the narrow crack. Ethan froze, realizing the figure was wearing the distinctive, embroidered waistcoat of the church warden, the elderly man who had happily sold them the historical tour brochure a few days ago, the man whose job was to ensure this door remained sealed. "Mr. Finch," Clara whispered, her eyes wide with horrified recognition. "He came back for us." A small, tear-filled sob escaped her. The recognition, the realization that the monstrous had been someone kind, someone helpful, was devastating. The warden, now a walker, made a soft, mournful sound, a sound of lingering humanity trapped in a corrupted body. Ethan had to grip the marble saint weapon to stop himself from reaching out. The encounter brought the reality of the infection crashing down. This was their neighbor, their local, a new tool. The moment of despair fueled Ethan's desperate need for action. "The door frame," he grunted, twisting his upper body. The piece of masonry that fell, it splintered the interior wood. He managed to reach a shard of thick, splintered oak from the inner door frame. It wasn't sharp, but it was sturdy. With agonizing effort, he jammed the wood shard into the main latch mechanism, forcing it to wedge. The action didn't open the door, but he felt a minute shift, a fractional psychological lift of the crushing pressure. "Did you feel that?" Ethan asked. "Yes, less weight. A fraction," Clara confirmed, hope mixed with pain. "It's temporary, but it means the mechanism can be compromised. It's not an immovable object." The telltale sound. As the distraction of the wedged wood subsided, they strained to hear the sounds of the church. Above the shuffling and the low, constant growl of the surrounding horde, they heard a familiar, hollow echo. The bell tower, Clara realized, her eyes darting upwards towards the ceiling. It must be huge. That's why the acoustics here are so strange. If we could get up there, we'd have visibility. "And a weapon," Ethan finished, his eyes lighting up. "A massive bell. If we could ring it, it would be heard for miles. It would attract every walker in the county, but it would also attract the National Guard at the quarry." The goal was still impossible, but it was a strategic, vertical option, a chance to turn their disadvantage into a desperate asset, a dangerous trade. Ethan was peering through the narrow gap where the door had slammed. Suddenly, a flash of color, not the brown and gray of the undead, caught his eye. A young girl, perhaps 10 years old, was huddled in a low-growing patch of rhododendrons near the church entrance, her face smeared with dirt and tears, clearly terrified but uninfected. "Clara, look! By the main entrance! A survivor!" Ethan mouthed, pointing. They cautiously rapped on the stone wall, trying to get her attention without alerting the milling walkers. The girl spotted the movement and froze, eyes wide with terror. Ethan used the small crack in the door, trying to speak, his voice a strained whisper. "Child, we're trapped. We need you to go to the main road. Head north. Find the quarry. Tell them people are trapped here." The girl stared at him, her body shaking uncontrollably. She was too panicked, too small, and too close to the danger. With a strangled whimper, she scrambled out of the bush and ran, not north toward the quarry, but blindly into the cluster of houses on the other side of the road, vanishing into the spreading infection. Their last, best hope for outside help had fled. The hunger, the exhaustion and dehydration were becoming unbearable. Clara was leaning against Ethan, her head heavy. "The sky is turning green," she muttered, her eyes unfocused. "Or maybe it's the stone. Did we pack mints? I can taste mint." "Hallucination, Clara. We need water." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry and rough. They returned to the unthinkable. The momentary lift from the splintered wood had faded. The pressure was back, and the crush injury was worse. "Ethan," she said, her voice dropping to a morbid certainty, "we have to be honest. If we get free, I won't be able to run. This leg is dead weight. If we had a chance to reach the bell tower, my leg would kill us both." She didn't suggest the break now. She suggested the amputation. The necessity of the radical measure was sinking in. Chapter 7. The Last Resort. The sun rose again, bathing the dusty sacristy in a weak, hostile light. The mood was grim, the reality of their self-amputation discussion hanging over them like a shroud. Ethan, searching his pockets one final desperate time, was running his fingers along the seams of his tweed jacket, feeling for a missed crumb, a forgotten pill. A discovery! His fingers snagged on a hard rectangular object, sewn deep into the interior lining of his jacket. A pocket he hadn't used in years. With a frantic tear, he ripped the lining open. Inside lay his multi-tool, a heavy German-made pocket knife with multiple blades and a small saw. He'd forgotten he kept it there after a hiking trip years ago. It was small, but it was metal, it was sharp, and it was a cutting tool. It was the first true weapon and tool they had found. "Clara," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We have a chance." The plan takes shape. The fear and the confession of the past days had stripped away all pretense and emotional baggage. They were a singular unit, laser-focused on escape. Clara pointed the penlight at the mechanism, her mind already several steps ahead. "The key isn't the latch. It's the wood around the lock assembly. We need to compromise the pressure on the frame itself. The door is wedged into the stone. If we gouge out enough wood, the frame will shift, and the pressure on our legs will release." The task was horrific. Ethan chose the smallest, sharpest blade and began. He had to bend and twist his body, carving at the heavy oak just inches from his trapped leg. It was painstaking, slow, and agonizingly silent. Every scrape of metal on wood felt deafening, a direct violation of their need for silence. Scrape, pause. Listen for the growls. Scrape, pause. The process was measured in hours. Their shoulders ached, their hands bled, and the smell of freshly cut ancient wood mixed with the rot outside. The nightmare at the window. Midday, while Ethan was buried in the work, the ground outside began to vibrate. Not the familiar thrum of a single walker, but a collective, heavy shaking. A large horde, dozens, perhaps 100, was moving across the churchyard, drawn by some distant noise or fresh meat. They converged on the church. The small, brittle window glass, already weakened by Ethan's marble strike in Chapter 3, could not handle the noise and proximity. The tweed jacket, their meager barrier, suddenly slipped. For a terrifying extended sequence, they were staring directly at a wall of distorted, hungry faces. A rotting hand with peeling skin was pressed against the glass, right where Clara's face was. Her eyes were inches from a mouth that was grinding its teeth. They became statues again, their hearts hammering against their ribs, their breaths held until their lungs screamed for air. Ethan stopped working instantly, his tool freezing inches from the wood. The test of character. The horde was focused on the window, its members shuffling and bumping each other, pressing closer. They were a few feet from being completely compromised. They had to act. Ethan's eyes frantically scanned the niche. He grabbed the small candy bar he had been saving as their last, desperate energy reserve. "I have to distract them," he mouthed to Clara. "I have to throw this as far as I can." Clara, who hadn't eaten solid food in days, whose energy was dwindling, nodded once, slowly. The decision to throw away their literal last hope for sustenance was a cruel, brutal test of character. Ethan threw the candy bar with every ounce of strength he had, angling it for distance toward the main road. The wrapper made a soft, rattling sound as it hit the pavement. It was enough. With a unified, chilling turn, the majority of the horde surged away from the sacristy and toward the new noise, leaving only a few stragglers behind. They had sacrificed their hunger for their lives. Clara's realization. Ethan resumed his work, sweat pouring down his face, the realization of what they'd done fueling his manic effort. Clara, watching his dedication, his capacity for violence, and his sacrifice, felt a deeper horror. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice cracking, "even if we get free, even if we make it out of the door, I can't run. I'll only slow you down. I'm a liability." Her realization was a crushing emotional conflict. She was seeing the terrible truth. Her crush injury, the very wound that had forced their closeness, might be the fatal liability that would force them apart forever in the outside world. The multi-tool's blade was dull, the oak dark with their sweat and flecks of blood. Ethan's arms felt dead, but his focus was absolute. He gouged out the last, crucial piece of wood near the hinge assembly, a section of the door frame that was holding the most pressure. The breakthrough! He paused, listening. The horde was still drawn toward the sound of the candy bar's impact, leaving the immediate vicinity of the sacristy relatively clear. "This is it, Clara," he grunted, bracing himself. "One shot, now!" With a simultaneous, screaming effort, they twisted their bodies and pulled their lower legs sideways, ignoring the blinding, ripping pain. The compromised frame gave way with a splintering, tearing crack. The pressure was gone. The door hadn't opened, but the frame had buckled just enough. They were free. The cost was immediate. Their legs were a mess of numb, agonizing tissue. They collapsed onto the floor of the sacristy, their lower bodies dragging. They were crippled, but mobile. They were alive. The immediate retreat. "Crawl!" Ethan ordered, his voice raw. He reached for the marble saint, their only weapon, and the water bottle. They dragged their inert, useless legs across the floor, scraping their elbows and hands against the stone, pulling themselves further into the dark, silent main body of the church. They passed the altar, the pews stretching out like silent, waiting judges. A high-backed oaken pew stood near the main sanctuary entrance. They crawled behind it, giving them their first true concealment, their first space wider than 2 feet, in nearly a week. The sound of the door. The main sacristy door, no longer held in place by the counter-pressure of their bodies against the frame, began to move. Slowly, agonizingly, it creaked open, pushed by the weight of the shuffling horde that had been pressing against it for days. The gap was small, less than a foot, but it was fatal. The first infected, a lean, wet figure, started to shuffle its way through the gap, securing the new position. "No time," Clara gasped, adrenaline overriding the debilitating pain. "The pew!" "We use the pew!" Ethan and Clara used their last burst of concerted, screaming effort, pushing with their shoulders, dragging with their arms. The heavy pew, designed to stay rooted for centuries, scraped across the stone floor with a deafening screech. They managed to wedge it against the half-open sacristy door, blocking the gap. It was temporary. The infected pushed back, but the old wood held for now. They were out of the coffin, but they were now in a new, larger, and scarier hunting ground. They were mobile, crippled prey, inside a vast, echoing stone structure. The growling and scraping at the sacristy door were a constant, infuriating reminder of their temporary reprieve. Their heavy breathing echoed in the huge, empty nave. "We can't stay here," Ethan said, his voice quiet. He was using his belt to cinch a makeshift tourniquet high on Clara's thigh, hoping to slow any internal bleeding. "They'll break through the door, or the main church windows. We have to go up. The race to the tower." He spotted the narrow, barely visible staircase near the organ loft. The way to the bell tower. They began the agonizing, slow climb, pulling themselves up the crumbling stone steps on their bellies, their legs dragging uselessly behind them. Every ancient creak and groan of the wooden steps threatened to alert the infected below. The climb was a relentless test of will, a vertical obstacle course of pain, a moment of grace. Halfway up, at a narrow landing, they found a small, low-ceilinged storeroom. Ethan pulled the heavy wooden door open and shone his penlight inside. A breath of relief. Inside, resting on a dusty shelf, was a forgotten emergency kit. They tore it open. 3 aged emergency flares, a half-empty bottle of communion wine, their first real liquid in days, and best of all, a massive, heavy iron poker, long and thick, used for managing the old stove. "A weapon," Clara breathed, seizing the poker. "And water." The poker was solid. It was heavy. It was a killing instrument. The bell's promise. The final push. They dragged themselves into the bell chamber. It was a vast, echoing space, open to the air on all sides through high, arched windows. They crawled to the edge and looked out. The view was panoramic. The entire ruined town below, smoking cars, scattered corpses, and the terrifying, constant shuffling movement. Then Clara pointed. On the distant horizon, visible through the haze, was the faint reddish glow of a large fire, surrounded by temporary floodlights. "The quarry," she whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. "The safe zone." "It's real." The sight of the distant hope, the faint glow of safety, doubled their resolve. The hard choice. Their hope was short-lived. They heard a distinct scraping sound from the stone staircase below. The walkers had found the stairs and were beginning their slow, inevitable ascent. "They'll be here in minutes," Ethan calculated, pulling his knife and bracing himself at the top of the stairwell. "We can't climb down. We're too slow. We're trapped." Clara looked from the distant safe zone to the massive, moss-covered church bell hanging silent and still in the center of the chamber. A massive rope, thick as a man's arm, hung down from the yoke. "We ring it," she said, her voice steel. "It's the only way. It will bring every walker for miles, but it's the only sound that will carry that distance. They have to know we're here. The sacrifice. They were making the ultimate gamble, trading immediate, certain death for a chance at salvation." Ethan squeezed her hand, a final tearful promise passing between them. He grabbed one of the flares from the kit and thrust it into Clara's hand. "When I ring, you launch that. High. Let them know what they're looking for." He took the heavy iron poker, approached the massive, thick rope, and looked down at his ruined legs, his exhausted body, and the woman he had almost abandoned. He was no longer the conflicted suburban husband. He was a warrior. With a grunt of pure, desperate resolve, Ethan began to swing the heavy poker against the immense bell rope. The poker struck the rope, which in turn jerked the heavy bell. The massive, ancient church bell rang out across the silent, ruined landscape. Clang! The sound was earth-shaking, echoing off the Mendip hills, a deafening declaration of defiance and desperation. It was instantly followed by an immediate, chilling and unified collective roar from below. A sound of hunger answered. Every infected creature in the immediate vicinity stopped shuffling and began to converge on the church. The holdout. The first of the infected reached the top of the stone stairs within minutes. They were a torrent of rotting flesh, drawn by the sound. "Clara! The poker!" Ethan, using his good arm, swung the heavy iron poker in a desperate, wide arc, hitting the first walker with a brutal, satisfying impact that sent it tumbling back down the narrow stairs, momentarily blocking the path for the others. Clara, her face streaked with tears and dirt, fumbled with the flare and lit it, the emergency light blinding in the dark tower. She launched it high into the night sky, a bright, hissing beacon toward the distant quarry. They held the bottleneck of the tower door, using the poker, the marble saint, and their frantic, desperate wills. Ethan's arms were failing, and the horde was pressing up the stairs with relentless force. The cavalry, just as the pressure became unbearable, just as the first walker started to climb over its fallen comrades, a new sound cut through the chaos, the rhythmic whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of heavy rotor blades. A small, black military helicopter from the safe zone, drawn by the twin signals of the bell and the flare, appeared over the tree line. A voice, magnified by a loudspeaker, boomed down from the aircraft, cutting through the church's thick stone walls. "We see you! Get to the roof!" Repeat, get to the roof for extraction. The final threshold. Their goal had shifted one last time. They spotted the final obstacle, a rusty, narrow access ladder bolted to the wall, leading to a small, square hatch on the roof of the bell tower. They abandoned their weapons. Ethan pushed Clara toward the ladder. He boosted her up, and she used her good arm to pull herself onto the first rung. Their climb was a screaming, painful, final scramble, a race against the growing tide of infected pooling beneath them. With a final, desperate heave, Clara pulled herself through the hatch, followed by Ethan, who scrambled onto the cold, damp roof of the ancient building. The helicopter, its searchlight blinding, hovered directly overhead. Two figures in tactical gear descended on ropes. Survival and resolution. The rescue was swift, brutal, and clinical. They were strapped into harnesses, their ruined legs ignored in the efficiency of the moment. As they were lifted away, high above the church, Ethan held Clara in a crushing embrace. They looked down. The old stone church was a black beacon, surrounded by a sea of turning, growling figures, their gamble successful. Their shared, traumatic experience had reforged their relationship. They were battered, broken, and critically wounded, but they were alive. The journey had just begun, but the old door, the symbol of their emotional trap, was firmly behind them. They were through the threshold.